So maybe it won't be finished in just one more podcast, but then what's the hurry? Let's read things as they are important. I'm not reading all the text, and yet I have to mention most important points as I see them fit. It's all subjective choice here, right? Value chain 13. So supplement sustainable procurement. Implement sustainable procurement practices. So universities tend to buy a lot of things, so then you can say there's nothing we can do about what we are buying. On the other hand, if you are large enough consumer, you can have a lot of influence on the supplier, on the supply chain, so your value chain can depend on making sure that you're being sustainable in your procurement practices. Sustainable purchasing policies targets operational emissions as well as emissions from a product's upstream value chain. This covers the wide range of equipment and supplies used by a university or a college, from educational material to larger equipment used in labs, residential quarters, and for general campus use. Comprehensive supplier policies should also cover service providers such as campus security or agencies. Procurement policies can also be adapted to university tenants, leasees, and campus retailers who use the institution's assets. On this campus here at IIT Bombay, where I am, I can tell you that there are lots of very nice student activities like the Tech Fest or the Mood Indigo and various innovation e-summit, etc., and they contract out the decorations, and a lot of people come in with truckloads of material. They put out nice decorations, and then when the program is over, they are torn down and often they're piled up somewhere, which gets obviously cleared up, but I'm not sure where it exactly goes and whether recyclability and procurement practices are being sustainable in these cases. Not to criticize my alma mater and my institute employer, but just to say how easy it is to miss simple things on how to do sustainable procurements. Most universities and colleges will have an existing supplier policy that can be updated to cover net zero principles, such as preferring suppliers who use renewable energy and renewable materials, or suppliers with established waste management practices. Sustainable purchasing policies that also cover emissions and ensure that universities and colleges work with an audited list of sustainability aligned vendors or suppliers. By purchasing from suppliers who share the same net zero values, institutions create a reinforcing loop by amplifying net zero ambitions across the supply chain. Although there is a challenging initiative, although this is a challenging initiative with a limited number of net zero aligned suppliers and low transparency of supply chains, it's critical for universities and colleges to communicate their expectations of their partners. Another big problem that I see here at my institution is that many times the rules or supplier policies are based on issuing tenders and buying from the lowest bidder and so on and so forth. So if you want to actually insist on certain sustainability standards or net zero standards, recyclability standards, and so on, you may have to modify this simple rule, because you will certainly get sued by people who are offering cheaper options, but you're buying more expensive options without stating clearly the rules that require or allow you to buy more expensive options based on these sustainability criteria. Benefits, challenges, and measuring are very similar to what we have seen before. So only additional thing here is sharing and enforcing net zero values with other businesses, and identifying suitable partners in the supply chain and influencing change for their existing suppliers are the challenges. Measuring again greenhouse gases and increased proportion of locally sourced products and increased visibility of over supply chains. So you can set up metrics and dashboards to track these things so that you are constantly updating your progress towards net zero in your value chain, and other aspects we looked at energy, water, food, transportation, etc. What to consider for sustainable procurement practices? Use the greenhouse gas inventory to identify the product or services with a high emission value chain. Internal life cycle assessment can identify products that have high extraction, energy, transportation, operational, and end-of-life related emissions. Life cycle analysis is an expertise that exists in many institutes, including the one I'm at, but they are usually doing research and applying it, or consulting with corporations on how to do it for them, but very little happens on doing life cycle analysis internally for the institute itself. But that can be changed easily with incentives and such initiatives as net zero. Combine net zero requirements with other sustainability related impacts on the environment and society to assess suppliers and vendors. Partner with key suppliers to build better processes and achieve key requirements. Network with industry and customer groups to build lobby groups. Lobby is not always a good word, but we may need this connection to industry and customer groups. Identify and emphasize standards and certifications to aid supplier assessment, so that you know that you're not going for the cheapest bid because of these emphasis on standards. Supply chain here, net zero considerations. You want to worry about raw materials, transport, manufacturing, transport, distribution and retail transport, and transport itself in terms of sourcing local products to minimize need for transport. Support logistics companies that are implementing electric vehicles or alternative forms of transport such as cargo bikes, right? So in distribution and retail, you want to worry about environmentally conscious packaging. Talk to suppliers about their net zero commitments, and you can use renewable energies and work towards a deforestation free supply chain. Finally, customers, rethink, reuse, reduce, refuse, repair, recycle before purchasing new products, right? We have more R's now. Rethink, refuse, reduce, reuse, repair, and recycle. Okay, campuses actually make good places for repairing phones, glasses, laptops, and so on and so forth. Okay, purchasing offsets. This I think will be the last part of this podcast. I'm feeling hungry. It's lunchtime. After all this, you may have to purchase offsets. Remember, we said we want to avoid offsets as much as possible, but there will be some remaining issues that can be solved with offsets. Compensatory action carbon credits or offsets can be used to improve net zero plans by reducing hard to abate emissions. These are emissions that are commercially prohibitive and difficult to remove with the current technologies, for example, emissions related to business travel, aviation. If you must allow exceptions for business travel, then you have to account for those excessive emissions that flying now brings. Certified carbon credits are generated through the financing of climate-friendly actions, such as investing in reforestation or renewable energy projects in other parts of the world. Given the potential for double counting, generating credits that have no additional value, and existence of spurious credits, universities and colleges should only purchase certified and valid offsets. So what do we mean by double counting? Essentially, there has to be additionality. If somebody is already implementing a solar farm, PV farm, and you are paying them as offsets, then you are double counting because they would have done it anyway. So they have to add more solar panels based on offset funding, or they have to sequester more carbon in reforestation than otherwise would be done anyway, and so on. It's called additionality. However, net zero plans that rely substantially on offsets risk being ineffective in achieving substantive emissions reductions and achieving climate goals. Therefore, offsets should only be considered after exploring all other initiatives and should only cover the hard to abate residual emissions. So principles to apply when considering offsets. Offsets should only be considered in conjunction with reducing emissions through other initiatives. Offsets can be used to reduce emissions from sectors which are lacking other viable reduction options. Consider offsets which are local to the university and to provide opportunities for education and collaboration, so that you tell the students this is where we are doing offsets, so students can go, learn, measure, validate, evaluate, and ensure real offsets, additionality. Use high quality certified offsets that are verifiable, long-term, and transparent. Check for offsets that are additional to business as usual. This is the additionality, i.e. the underlying carbon reduction or removing activity should not have occurred otherwise. So additionality is important. Offsets should have a low risk of being undone. For example, a forest should not be destroyed after it has been sold as an offset. If you give somebody money for reforestation, they put a plant, you make sure that there is a plant, but they remove it next year for whatever reason, then you haven't really put away the carbon long enough. Ensure the offset is ethical and sustainable and does not negatively impact indigenous or marginalized communities. Harder and harder to track. Examples of this occurring is when land available for offsets is exploited for profits, which leaves the inhabitants of the land vulnerable to food shortages and eviction. Ensure transparent disclosures of current emissions and accounting for practices and targets to reach net zero. So these kind of monitoring and evaluation sometimes gets outsourced to a third party. For example, organic food place may be saying something is organic and has been certified by a third party. Who is responsible to make sure that the third party is not cheating? This can be an issue and has happened in the past. Okay. Benefits. Targets hard to abate emissions can be addressed with offsets, can reduce a greater share of emissions earlier, and challenges are ethical and valid use of offsets and sourcing certified offsets so that you're sure that actual valid offset is happening, and measuring the impact has to include transparent and verifiable carbon offset impacts. Okay, so one of the big ideas then to do net zero on campus is to how to amplify that innovation, finding practices and lessons learned to a wider community. Universities and colleges must be seen as examples of not only teaching their students and sending them out, but also being able to transfer their lessons and their innovations to the wider community outside the campus. So we'll come back and look at that in the next and hopefully the last podcast. Okay.